thank you, Mr. Moran, to you and your officials for appearing today. I'd like to echo what the Chairman said in his opening remarks, and just say from my own point of view, I've always enjoyed our exchanges here on the committee. I think you've been a transformative Secretary-General of the Department of Finance, and I think, as you rightly say in your opening statement, today is a good opportunity to look back at the last 2 years in terms of how the department has been managed and the different things that you point to in that statement. I'd also like to look, if we have time, at the medium-term strategy later on, because I think it's probably the most important document that your department has produced while you've been there, and it deserves merit, I suppose, in going through it in some detail. As it may be your last appearance, please feel free to be as open as you'd like to be and forthcoming in discussing issues in relation to the department. But you mentioned the Right report in your opening statement. Was that the first thing you picked up when you went into the department 2 years ago? Is that where you started?
I didn't quite have the luxury when I started in the department. You may remember it was in the middle of a banking crisis, and so I actually had to deal with the banking stuff first. But in the course of the first year, working and having the luxury, in some respects, before becoming Secretary General, of having to spend some time in the department working in the banking unit, it allowed me to observe some of the way the departments worked, and clearly I had my own observations in terms of the governance and the various things. It was a department, you may recall, was being split in two as well, so that left an opportunity to actually revisit governance structures in a way perhaps that wouldn't have been possible if everything had been as before. The Right report had been already a document that had identified issues in the department, and Kevin quite correctly suggested before I embarked on thinking about my own ideas about where we might go, that I should pick it up. And in fact, one of the things we did was to compile a report looking at all the recommendations in that report against what we could do. But I think that, as I mentioned, and I think it's obvious from the list that I've just given, there were other things that could and were obvious in terms of things we might need to do in the department, some of which I think it's fair to say were caused by the split, because inevitably when you split a whole into two, some pieces moved to either side of the line, and that left some gaps in our side that we needed to recreate.
So when you took over the position as Secretary General, had any of the changes pointed to in the Right report been implemented, or had the process begun in terms, or was that just still sitting?
No, there was a process underway. I think what has perhaps changed is that what we did during the last 2 years, as we did in other areas, is to try and split people's responsibilities up more. So by setting up a corporate office who were driving some of the things like the introduction of business planning and the rest, it meant that there were people for whom that was their day job, and that was what they had to do. And they were somewhat insulated, I suppose it's fair to say, from the day-to-day problems that were hitting us from all sides at that stage.
Mm-hmm. And then, when you list the different things that have happened there, the person now dealing with the state's accounts, 20 years accounting experience, there's a risk office, the risk officer, there's project management teams, etc. It's a total restructuring of the department in the past 2 years. A total change in the landscape in terms of how the Department of Finance works. Is that fair to say?
Yeah. What became obvious to me in some respects, and take risk as a good example, is a lot of people in the department focused on things that one would describe as risk. So risk was being managed by people who were thinking, what's the risk? The tax doesn't come in at the right level, or any other issues in terms of the banking issues. What is different in the way we've approached it is that while people are still focused on those, and indeed spend their time identifying risks that they deal with and come up with plans as to how to deal with them, there are now separate groups of people who manage the risk register, who actually sit in a room with other people across the department, thinking about risks that occur across the whole area so as to do peer review. And it was some of that structure that was missing in terms of where we're going. And in fact, now what we'll see is that we have been involved in the recently published National Risk Assessment, where in fact some of those techniques will spread all the way across government.
But the types of changes that have taken place in the department would imply that it wasn't being well managed prior to your appointment to Secretary General. Would that be fair?
I think everybody understands that there were failings in the system. I think that it is very difficult with hindsight to try and decide what one would have done or would not have done. I think one observation I had during the period of time I was there was that compared to other environments in which I'd worked, we were looking at a series of challenges that were being managed by people that were very critical point issues to be dealt with across the system, with, as I mentioned already, even at this stage, some limited information in terms of being able to deal with them. And therefore, it's sort of very easy to come in and say, well, in other environments, we would have seen more people dealing with those issues. We would have seen stuff. Whereas people took the decision, understandable again at the time perhaps, in terms of budgetary restrictions, to not perhaps resource the problems as much as they might have. And that in many ways was one of the lessons I've been trying to sort of mention in the speech, is that I think we need to find a just medium, both in this committee and elsewhere, to not create an environment where people are afraid to actually spend money and to invest in dealing with problems.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And then just in relation to then when you said about getting settled in the department, you then turned to something like the right report, or the report the department had done on the right report in terms of how it would implement it. Were there any recommendations you didn't agree with in that report?
Off the top of my head, I don't recall exactly what it was. I mean, I know we spent a lot of time going down through them. I mean, in fact, I think we have had a document that we've even sent in, I think, to this committee with actually where we go. Some of them were no longer relevant, quite frankly, because having the right report was about a department with a lot of other issues, including spending and others. Our approach, where it differs perhaps to the right report, and in fact it was more necessary the way we had restructured the department shortly after my original arrival in 2011, is that when we brought in the team from the NTMA who were managing the shareholder in the banks, integrated everything into one unit rather than having two separate ones, it became perhaps easier to see that we were in some respects also not just the department looking after the state's finances, but we were in a sense the department looking after the shareholdings in 6 large institutions, the banks, some of which were being wound down, and actually NAM on top of that. So moving towards an environment which would replicate, in some respects, a large holding company structure, and having a legal department, having a risk committee, was actually a much more obvious step to move at that stage, because the department had, in a sense, a policy function and a shareholding function. And then we, in discussing it through with colleagues, understood that the type of techniques that are used in the management of shareholding, in the management of entities, actually were quite applicable to a lot of the decisions we were taking and the way we were dealing with the issues in policy.
Okay. Just to touch upon then bringing the expertise in, because I mean, looking at the recommendations in the right report, it talked about substantially increasing analytical capacity in the tax policy area. We spoke previously about getting staff in the department, the right staff, and you mentioned it today in terms of things like reputational risk, but also it's been raised in terms of salaries. So when you went about, I mean, sitting back, looking at it now in terms of the new staff you've taken in, I think you said 100 new have come in. Are you happy with the capacity in the department to meet things like tax forecasting or risk analysis in the different areas?
John might kick me here from the side on this one, but I think, you know, I mentioned the struggling that one has to have in terms of the information technology that's available to us. You know, I mean, there is a certain element of duplication of effort when things are too manual. When you're moving from one spreadsheet to another, you have to double check stuff. If you had a single integrated system, we could have a lot more information. We could optimally, I think, have a better sense of where forecasting needs to go by drawing on information sources from other areas. That technology does not exist in the system at the moment. As for the sort of more intellectual challenge of doing this and engaging in that, I think we are in a very good shape. We had the fortunate position when I took over as Secretary General that a large number of institutions volunteered staff to us because it was just simply not possible to hire staff at the speed we would need to do so that we could work pro bono in the department and actually train up people internally, because it takes some time to train up people. During the presidency as well, we had a similar interchange of people who came in from the private sector and worked with the department. I think we still have some work to do in terms of allowing and encouraging more people that have grown up in the department and have, in fact, the department as a career for the future, allowing them to actually spend some time external to the department in other environments and vice versa with other people, because I think that mix of skill sets would actually improve the overall.
I mean, not unlike, I suppose, yourself in terms of moving in and out of the department and bringing other expertise into it. The financial or the data management system, though, seems to be a particular issue for you in terms of where the department needs to go from here, in terms of its forecasting and managing difficulties that
It's
might
perhaps
arise?
not just the department, it's the entire of government. You know, it's actually moving towards an environment in which we are able to use the information that's across the whole system in a much more automated way than is currently the thing, and to use some of the work that's been done by the Central Statistics Office and others, who I think Padraig has said some of the same things, that actually having, you know, a greater investment in just using this type of stuff. We are in a world of open data, but we aren't necessarily in a position where those techniques are yet finding their way into the cohesive whole of government approach.
And proposals for that being put forward already to the minister or to?
Well, we started to mention it, but I mean, I think we need to. I mean, you know, maybe I can say this today. I couldn't have said it 2 days ago, right? But I mean, I don't think we should be. We should be kind of ignorant of the fact that this is a very, very large multi-year project. I mean, some of the work that Greg is already trying to do on just the financial accounts is a series of improvements over a large number of years, which will involve quite a lot of effort by people. But as we move out of a period, which we've been in, of crisis management across the entire system into a period of stability and building for the future, I think there is an opportunity to, in fact, you know, focus on this kind of stuff as well. And some of what the Department of Public Expenditure Reform are doing is looking at techniques to allow a whole of government approach to move forward.
So is that falling then to the Department of Public Expenditure Reform rather than Finance? Is it?
I mean, this is a whole. I mean, this requires people across the whole system. I mean, some of what we are trying to do is, for example, on the economic modelling side. Previously, the ESRI and the central bank were involved in developing a model, and John's team, now that they have extra resources, are able to participate in that as well.
And what's the relationship with the department now with the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform? Because you spoke about closer collaboration with the departments and everything else, but has it proven difficult for finance, being cut in half, if you like?
Well, it's a very good decision to keep us all in the same building, because that actually, in effect, allows people to continue working together very well. We both participate in the economic management councils, as you know, and we kind of share the preparation of papers. There is a quarterly exercise of looking at the exchequer returns, which involves both the expenditure side and the revenue side. And that, by definition, means that the people are stitched together on a constant basis during the year, which is incredibly important in terms of the preparation of the budget at the other end. On other stuff that we both, in effect, have shared views and purpose in terms of the infrastructure development in the state, they help identify what actually are the projects that need to be done. Our department can bring to that some of the other elements of what we do in terms of the financing techniques to find ways to actually bring new financing to those type of objectives.
And then in terms of management then between the two departments, I mean, are there very fluid management structures? Could an assistant secretary or second secretary go straight to a member of staff and deeper with a task, or are you completely siloed in separate departments?
There's a very surprising amount of work done. In fact, actually, we were just talking during the short break with some of the people who are asking, would we come and present to one of their committees on some of the work we're doing? So you get this integrated thing. I mean, as I said, the proximity in terms of being in the building certainly helps.
And then in terms of bringing in outside people, you talked about opening up competition for assistant secretary to open competition outside of the department. I mean, how successful has that been in bringing new people in?
Yeah, it's actually not just assistant secretary, it's actually from assistant principal up. So it's
Okay.
assistant principal, principal officer and assistant secretary, which we have taken a view to do for a number of reasons. One of the things that has occurred with that is it has also helped to set the benchmark for people and set an understanding in terms of the people inside. So in fact, actually, we've had a number of people who have been successful in competitions, but maybe after a year of performance management where they've gone through additional training or realised additional skills that they need. We've had some people come into the department who have come in at a particular level, have found that actually they can go for a competition at a level above that and therefore move with sort of extra speed through the system in effect to find their appropriate level. So I would say it's been very successful in terms of an exercise and in fact well received by the staff.
But when they come in like that, are they coming in on a fixed contract for a 3-year period, or do they come in and become permanent members of the civil service?
No, they would come in as permanent members.
Okay.
Typically, I mean, I wouldn't. There are probably some people who have come in on fixed contracts as well, but typically, so if we took in, I think, in the course of 2012, something like 40 graduates or AOs, assistant officers, and they were eligible for these various competitions as well, subsequently, along with the rest of our staff.
And then just the last question I wanted to ask in this area was in relation to performance management, which you touched upon. And you said now that 100% of staff go through the performance management review. What does that involve?
This is essentially there's a once-a-year process of sitting down with the manager and actually going through a form. I mean, in a way, we had a difficulty the first year starting it off because, in some respects, because of the lack of completion at the beginning, the objectives hadn't necessarily been set for people. So this, in effect, is one could describe as sort of now we've just completed the second cycle of where we're going. What should happen is that objectives should be set on an individual basis for everybody. They are checked by the corporate office and the HR people to map up to the business planning process, so that there's an alignment of actually the department's objectives, the individual units' deliverables, and how individuals contribute to that during the course of the year. To the extent that we identify at the beginning of the year that to complete those objectives or for other reasons of progressions, that training or extra sort of help on that respect might be useful, then that's actually noted at that form and it crosses over to the HR team. We then build that into the learning and development plan for that person. We get to the end of the, there's a mid-year review, and then you get to the end of the year where there is a genuine sort of series of conversations with the people. What was interesting as a departure in the last series, and I think it worked very well, is that there had been some discussion about whether and how you set the exam equally for people across the entire department. Because inevitably they're sort of achieving objectives, exceeding objectives and whatever else. It's important that people feel, for the system to work well, that the same exam standard is set for everybody. And in order to encourage that, what we brought in at this round is, beginning at the level of the senior management, we actually had a departmental-wide, you could say, discussion of all of, and it falls down through a cascade, but we had a discussion of all the principal officers where the management team actually all had exchanged their own views about what they thought the relative performance of those people were. And then we asked those people, who of course were initially quite sort of, dubious about how this process works, to in fact do the very same thing for the assistant principals that were working down through them as it cascaded through the audience. So I think this year round we have got to a point of people feeling a lot more comfortable that this is a fair assessment of those people. And if we have problems, and we have had sort of, situations where we've said these people are performing less than maybe their peers, we've identified that, worked with them to actually improve, sort of if it's a matter of not having the right skill sets or training, because as I said, there's been a lot there was probably a 6-year period where there was very little training actually done in the department, and working with that, and you'll see that in our accounts in terms of the excess budget, or the extra budget that's put into training and development now in terms of the department.
So, aside from the investment that needs to take place in IT systems to manage information and data, I mean, is what's left for the department to do in terms of changing its structures, its internal structures, or is it done now? Is this the job complete in terms of?
Quite to be honest, it is not done. I mean, there is a path to go through. I mean, the way I described this to somebody earlier today is we now have a risk committee that meets. They are on a sort of a monthly pattern of meeting and getting together. They will have to continue meeting and talking about risks that they have. And I think with each subsequent discussion, the discussion gets better. The process works better. The crossover between that and the policy committee and all the various communications that have to happen improves. The parliamentary, the parliamentary question submission system that now means that we no longer have paper. We're moving that over, same technology, to be all submissions that go through on policy matters. What this will do is it will help to create a much better record of the process of deliberation. It will help to sort of make that automated so it can be searched, so people can actually find stuff much more easily. And so, this is it's a continuous process of improvement. I mean, it doesn't just stop.
Are other departments now kind of mirroring this? Are they copying the improvements you're making in terms of, for example, that information flow in relation to parliamentary questions?
Yeah, a parliamentary question is a very good example. And in fact, you asked about our interaction with the Department of Public Expenditure and Reform. Both departments have actually engaged in doing that together. because in fact the outsourced IT is actually a function of the Department of Public Expenditure. So we're moving to a system. In fact, we've already moved on the parliamentary questions. They're also participating in the exercise to move ministerial submissions and policy submissions onto an automated basis. We're both moving together, so therefore we can actually then roll that further out. And indeed, the genesis for that exercise was a journey that one of our people did to go to other departments to spot other best practices, because some departments are in fact ahead of others, and there were others that already had some of this stuff.
Chair, I'd actually like to stop there. If I may come back though on the strategy for growth